Thank you. And as you can see, one of the most difficult things is standing up. But we've made it. So I'd like to talk to you today about a few of the results of the last Intergovernmental Report on Climate Change. The Working Group 1 report was released on September 27th of this last year and had a number of significant findings that are pertinent to the Pacific. So one of the main conclusions of this Working Group 1 report, which is the physical science basis, right now in Yokohama, Japan, Working Group 2 is meeting to decide the output of the impacts and vulnerabilities. The warming in the climate system is unequivocal, and since 1950, many changes have been observed throughout the climate system that are unprecedented over decades to millennia. Each of the last 3 decades has been successively warmer at the Earth's surface than any preceding decade since 1850. I generally don't read from slides, but because this is the one key finding of the Working Group 1 report for the 5th assessment report, and it underscores the findings of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th assessment reports as well. That the warming is unequivocal. It is something that we have to deal with. Next slide, please. And for the Pacific, one of the most urgent issues is sea level rise. And what you see on this slide is the sea level rise from 1700 projected forward to 2100. The red line is the line that we're currently on for 2100 if we stay on the current emissions trajectory. And we're looking at a meter of sea level rise compared to pre-industrial in 2100. And what you can also see from this slide is while sea level rise was relatively flat until 1900, between 1900 and now, the rate of sea level rise has been increasing. It will increase further still until 2100. Next slide, please. And so if we look at the observational evidence, because as a scientist, we always have to go back to what the observations are, we can see that sea level rise has risen to date 20 centimeters. Just for reference, that's about this much. For reference, a meter is about this much compared to the floor, okay? So this is what we're talking about, and we're already having to deal with significant challenges. So the total sea level rise to come by 2100 on the current trajectory is at a meter or 120 centimeters. And since we began discussing this, and since the UNFCCC was put in place in 1992, sea level has risen by another 5.5 centimeters, by about this much. Next slide, please. So in Tuvalu, what you see in this king tide is in the middle panel on the bottom is the tide coming in and bubbling up through the airstrip that you see in the bottom right-hand panel. Next slide, please. In Majuro, in the Republic of the Marshall Islands in June, we had this situation with king tides, with these areas becoming very difficult to live in. We had the airstrip eroding away. We had the airport closed for 3 days. And so these are becoming increasing challenges. And I didn't have time, and I don't have time today to show you the slides from the YouTube video of what's going on, what happened in Majuro just in the last 2 weeks with the king tide there. Next slide, please. So in Majuro as well in in the Marshall Islands in Yenrock, these are the graves that are washing away. These are the graves of the ancestors that are washing away. So sea level rise is something that we're beginning to deal with in the Pacific on a daily basis. Next slide, please. Ooh, you can't see this very well. And I don't have a laser pointer, I don't think. Oh, I do have a laser pointer. So these are the tropical cyclone projections for the South Pacific. And here are the intensities. And I think one of the take-home message, this is the North Pacific, and this is the South Pacific. And what we saw in the previous projections of tropical cyclones was that there wouldn't be more tropical cyclones, but there would be more intense tropical cyclones. Now we have a little bit more spatial information, and we can see that, yes, indeed, for the North Atlantic, where there's plenty of data, there are more intense tropical cyclones. But for the South Pacific, we actually don't have data enough to be conclusive that the tropical cyclones will be more or less intense. And in the North Pacific, we can say that there are indications that there will be more intense. And this is where science and our human experience of the last few years may not completely meet one another, because the human experience, I think, for those who have endured tropical cyclones, the typhoons that passed through the North Pacific and hit the Philippines in December of last year, again in December of this year, those who are living in Hawaii with Tropical Cyclone Ian, the experience of the floods that we had just a few weeks ago here, all of those are consistent with a changing climate. Next slide, please. In addition, we have changing rainfall patterns, and what you see here is the drought and the state of emergency that was declared in the Marshall Islands earlier this year. And these are really important, intense events that impact human beings, and they're unlikely to get any better over the next 83 years until we get to 2100. Next slide, please. And this is just a look at the emission trajectories that we're on. If you look at the bottom left-hand side of the graph, you can see where we began negotiating for lower and lower emissions. As you proceed to the right side of the graph, you can see the Copenhagen Accords, where we set the limit to be about 2 degrees C, and you can see the unprecedented rise in CO2 emissions that we've seen since then. Next slide, please. So what does that mean that the future holds? The warming to date is about 0.9 degrees centigrade. The warming to come is another 4 to 6 degrees centigrade if we stay on the red line and the red trajectory. That would give us about 1 meter to 1.2 meters of sea level rise. The light blue, the bottom blue line is the trajectory we would be on if we took very aggressive measures to stop CO2 emissions and to keep temperature below 2 degrees C. So I think that this is an opportunity for us all to come together and to collaborate on how we're going to increase the resilience of the Pacific to what we have in store. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we're working on very hard, and many of us in the Pacific are working on very hard, is building community resilience to climate change. And for that, what we see coming out of much of the work in the Pacific is that we have to attend to the 7 C's. Collaboration. We cannot be territorial about this, that we must come together to find solutions, that we have to focus on communities, communities at the village level, communities in urban areas, communities of people who are empowered to make a difference and to build resilience to climate change. Conduct. How do we each conduct ourselves as individuals and leaders to lead us towards a more sustainable path? Culture. How do we make sure that the incredible diversity of cultures in the Pacific is preserved and is part of building resilience for the future? Conservation. How do we build on the legacy of the locally managed marine protected areas to make sure that we have a future? Commitment. How do we make sure that we have commitments that are beyond 1 year, 2 years, 3 years? How do we make sure that we have commitments that will last until 2100, when we'll begin to see the biggest impacts? And how do we make sure that we, as Pacific Islanders, have the confidence to go forward, to take on this challenge, and to build a resilient Pacific for the future? Next slide, please. So, thank you in all of the languages of the Pacific. And I want to emphasize that I think it's really important to weave together both the scientific knowledge that I presented at the beginning of the talk and the cultural legacy and the cultural knowledge that we have to weave a sail for the future. So thank you very much.